The Trump regime has long been marked by internal chaos and abrupt reversals of policy, but the latest dispute over whether furloughed federal workers will be paid during the government shutdown has only added to that record of disorder. A draft White House memo suggests that federal employees placed on furlough during the current government shutdown may not be guaranteed compensation for their unpaid time off, a dramatic departure from prior policy and a move that could intensify pressure on Congress to end the standoff. If adopted, this interpretation would deny back pay to as many as 750,000 federal workers, marking an escalation in Donald Trump's effort to push Senate Democrats toward approving a spending measure without additional conditions related to protecting healthcare subsidies. The shutdown, now entering its second week, has already disrupted operations across key federal agencies. At the center of the controversy is the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act of 2019, enacted following the record-setting 35-day shutdown that began in December 2018. That law was intended to guarantee that all federal employees, both those furloughed and those required to work without pay, would receive full back pay once government funding was restored. However, the new legal analysis from the Office of Management and Budget takes a different position. Sources claim the OMB argues that the law's wording makes back pay contingent upon congressional approval of new appropriations. Specifically, the memo points to the phrase stating that employees shall be compensated subject to the enactment of appropriations acts ending the lapse. Critics argue that this is a misreading of both the statute's language and intent. Congressional aides and legal experts note that the 2019 legislation explicitly applies to any shutdown beginning or after December 22, 2018, meaning it was designed to cover all future lapses in funding, not just the one that prompted its passage. Now, the OMB, under the direction of Project 2025's Russell Vogt, has an interpretation that stands in stark contrast to earlier statements from other federal agencies. As early as September, guidance from the Office of Personnel Management and the Council of Economic Advisers affirmed that furloughed employees were automatically entitled to back pay once appropriations resumed. Those guidelines referenced the 2019 law as establishing a permanent guarantee. Yet, with Donald Trump's regime in place, the law appears irrelevant. In a quiet revision to its public guidance on September 30th, the OMB deleted that language. The latest version of its frequently asked questions during a lapse in appropriations no longer includes any mention of the Fair Treatment Act or its back pay assurances. The only change between the two versions of the document, aside from the date, was the removal of that reference, an omission that has drawn widespread attention among federal employee unions and lawmakers alike. The updated OMB document now says only that accepted employees are entitled to receive payment for their performance of accepted work during the period of the appropriations lapse, when appropriations for such payments are enacted. Gone is the clear statement that furloughed workers will receive retroactive pay as soon as possible after the lapse ends. The dispute reflects a broader pattern under the Trump regime, a willingness to test the limits of executive authority. Russell Vogt has been a key figure in that approach, advancing policies that push the boundaries of the president's powers. Since the shutdown began last week, Vogt has also announced the withholding of up to $28 billion in federal infrastructure and energy funds, largely affecting Democratic-leaning states and cities such as New York. The move has been widely interpreted as part of a multi-pronged strategy to make the effects of the shutdown more painful for political opponents and increase pressure for a compromise on Trump's terms. Federal agencies across Washington have been forced to curtail operations as funds dry up. The Internal Revenue Service, which initially kept many employees on duty using carryover funds, announced on Wednesday that those reserves had been exhausted. Tens of thousands of IRS employees were subsequently sent home without pay. The Internal Revenue Service, which initially kept many employees on duty using carryover funds, announced today that those reserves had been exhausted. The IRS expects to furlough roughly 35,000 workers, nearly half of its workforce. Other agencies, including the Departments of Transportation and Interior, have issued similar furlough orders as the shutdown rages on. Both Democrats and Republicans in Congress have rejected the regime's new interpretation. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle contend that the 2019 law settled the question of back pay once and for all. House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Louisiana Republican and supposed Christian, said he believes furloughed workers are clearly entitled to retroactive pay when the government reopens. He added that President Trump privately agrees, despite the OMB memo suggesting otherwise. Legal scholars have echoed that view. They argue that the plain text of the Fair Treatment Act, combined with its legislative history, leaves no room for ambiguity. Congress intended to ensure that federal workers would not be penalized financially for shutdowns caused by political gridlock. The administration's new reading, they say, could invite lawsuits from affected employees and their unions. The OMB memo fits within a larger pattern of aggressive executive actions in line with Project 2025's mandate for leadership during this administration. By reinterpreting existing laws and reallocating funds, the White House has sought to expand presidential authority in ways that bypass traditional checks and balances. Critics warn that using workers' livelihoods as leverage in political negotiations undermines the independence of the civil service and could erode morale within federal agencies. Supporters argue that the administration is operating within its legal discretion and that Congress should bear responsibility for ending the shutdown by passing a clean funding resolution. For now, the shutdown remains in effect, and hundreds of thousands of federal workers face weeks or possibly months without pay. Whether they ultimately receive back pay will likely depend on how Congress and the courts respond to the OMB's interpretation. If the White House follows through on its legal argument, the consequences could extend beyond the shutdown. Future administrations might cite this precedent to withhold compensation during funding lapses, fundamentally altering the protections established by the 2019 law. As agencies brace for prolonged disruption, federal employees find themselves caught in the crossfire of a constitutional and political crisis. The conflicting directives, sudden reversals, and legal improvisations that now define this regime have turned governance itself into an exercise in uncertainty, an ongoing reminder of the chaos that erupts whenever the Trump White House issues a new edict. I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.